Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this event. Thanks for letting us know where you're from in the chat. See folks from North Carolina, New York City, Virginia, Tennessee, several places. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Keep it going. Before we officially get started, let's take a moment to center ourselves. You could close your eyes, lower your gaze, just feel your feet on the ground. Just take deep breaths. Being aware of the full length of your body. It's March the 4th, 2023. 10:03 a.m. in the East Coast. Thank you, everyone. Welcome again. We have on the panel with us several amazing people. We're here, first of all, to go deep into this amazing book, Virgin Territory, Configuring Female Virginity in Early Christianity, by the Professor Julie Kelto Lillis. And we're just like so excited. I am so excited to get into this book. And we have also with us panelists. We have Dr. Maia Kotrosits. We have Dr. Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones. We have Dr. Saadia Yacoob. Welcome, welcome to you all here. The chat is open. Feel free to use that to send your affirmations, your thoughts to the whole group. There is also a Q&A button at the button. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to use that to send questions to the hosts and the panelists, and we will get to those at the end. With that said, welcome again, everyone, and I hand it off to Professor Julie Kelto Lillis, who is the Assistant Professor of Early Church History at Union Theological Seminary. Her primary research interests concern ancient constructions of social difference, some of which today we now call sexuality and gender. Her teaching spans several periods. She's also interested in Christian theologians, saints, and diverse ancient perspectives on the body, healing, and disabilities. Welcome, Professor Julie Kelto Lillis.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to have these panelists here. I bet you didn't know that you get like a disco in my background some of this time. The lighting on Zoom today decided to give you like, wee, so that might stop after a while, we'll see. I'm thrilled to welcome my students, our prospective students, the union community, academic colleagues, and everyone joining us from the wider public as we discuss this book and the work of these amazing guests who are with me. I'm going to summarize a bit about the book to get us started. Virgin Territory examines social and theological reasoning about virginity in early Christian texts. It draws from others' insights in many flavors of early Christian studies and several more fields focused on ancient Mediterranean groups, as well as feminist historical work across periods. My main aim was for readers to question what they think they know about the concept of virginity and see what emerges when we let go of that. Fascinating projects on women's virginity and antiquity were published in the past 40 years, but we in early Christian studies have often failed to ask critical questions at a more fundamental level. What if writers don't all mean the same kind of virginity when they talk about it? What if they use terms in divergent ways? We know things that seem self-evident about bodies are not actually self-evident. We interpret them however our cultures teach us to. What if early Christian thinkers did not all view women's bodies the same way as each other or as modern readers? Studies from other fields have noted multiple meanings for ancient virginity words, non-medical methods ancient societies imagined for testing virginity, and variations in how people visualized the reproductive system. And when we get to some parts of that, things might get a little bit graphic or startling at first. In ancient texts, virgins are sometimes women who have not had sex, but other times being a virgin is about age or marital or reproductive status. Virgins are teenagers or unmarried maidens or wives who are not yet mothers. Most ancient methods for testing sexual virginity involve oaths or ordeals, testimony or supernatural signs, not inspections of sex organs. Sources on sex or healthcare from ancient Mesopotamian and classical Greek contexts discuss women's anatomy, but concepts like a vaginal barrier of hymen tissue are absent. When texts refer to bleeding and pain that sometimes accompany first penetration, they explain it other ways. Today's health literature emphasizes how variable and frankly unpredictable hymen tissue can be, and how useless it is for proving virginity or its loss, making it easy to understand why ancient people and their healthcare providers could encounter vaginas without interpreting hymen tissue as a meaningful body part of its own. Previous studies brilliantly highlighted diverse early Christian views on why virginity matters and how to prove someone has it. But we did not back up far enough and question our most basic assumptions. Instead, many scholars have assumed that from time immemorial, anyone worried about whether someone with a vagina is staying virginal could simply have asked an expert to check their vagina if they were so inclined. We've treated texts that omit or reject concepts like hymens or inspections as if they're innovative challenges to long-held knowledge about virgins' anatomy. My book argues otherwise. When we stop assuming past societies must have counted body parts as we do, when we pause before jumping to interpret ancient texts with current notions in mind, when we search more closely for what individual writers mean by virginity of the body, then new contrasts and textures of thought emerge. Early Christian thinkers had a diverse palette at their fingertips for depicting virginity and how one embodies it. They used existing definitions strategically and shaped new ones. They produced writing on virginity that's theologically rich and politically fraught. The broad brush we were using to portray their thinking can be put away and finer strokes begun. Inner chapters of the book attempt these finer strokes. Writers portray Jesus's mother Mary as virginal during childbirth, using diverse meanings for their diverse purposes, and sometimes making profound claims about God transforming human limitations into new possibilities. Distinct meanings across early texts often get merged in later ones. 4th century authors who promote lifelong virginity use shared terms and imagery in contrasting ways and develop divergent pictures of how one preserves or acquires virginity, what bodily virginity is, and how virginity of body and soul relate. Outer chapters of the book chart a shift in beliefs about virginity and the costs of that shift in women's lives and Christian thought. Crucially, notions about proving virginity that many today take for granted did start to emerge in early centuries of the Common Era and gained traction in very late antiquity. A new common sense or widespread belief appeared that women's genitals can show whether they are virgins. I try to get precise about this by distinguishing between physiology, what the body does, its fluids, its functions, and anatomy, what the body has, its structures and shapes. Earlier references to bleeding and pain are to physiological phenomena that don't necessarily show anatomical concepts. And before the Common Era, it's very rare for blood to be treated as proof of virginity. Notions of a barricade or a distinctive size or shape for virgins' vaginas are anatomical ideas that arose later. Virgins could be said to have other distinctive qualities of the voice or neck or breasts or urine. What's striking about very late antiquity is heightened interest in the idea of noticeably virginal vaginas, seen in sources from multiple regions and religious traditions. Some use physiology. Virgins bleed or have noticeably dry or tight tissue. Others use anatomy. Virgins have a narrow vagina or an innate barricade somewhere between labia and uterus. What unites the varying pictures is the belief that women's virginity makes itself evident genitally. When did this change happen? Quick source snapshots go like this. After scattered non-anatomical references, like the rare use of bleeding as proof in one early biblical text, we find a 2nd century CE physician in Rome, someone working mainly in non-Christian, non-Jewish circles, who mentions the idea of a hymen-like barrier, then gives 3 reasons it cannot exist. So someone by around this time is inventing or developing the notion of a hymen, and it's probably not doctors. Next, we see 2 early 3rd century Christian writers in Carthage of Roman North Africa, each drawing on that innovative notion to discuss Mary or local vowed virgins. A couple of Christian text scholars have thought belong on this part of the timeline, do not. And Jewish sources like the Mishnah offer ideas about bleeding, not anatomy. Then, big clusters of texts that treat virginity as genitally perceptible appear in the 390s and early 400s in Christian literature, at a similar time in Jewish literature, in pharmacology recipes for making vaginas seem virginal, in commentaries on pagan classics that gloss a different hymen term. Some of this evidence may actually come from 7th century layers of editing, and that's also when we find the first medical writer to visualize a hymen-like barrier for a reproductive system previously visualized as unobstructed. And his discussion shows that that new addition is a sort of awkward fit. On this timeline, inspections to verify sexual virginity arise later than scholars have said in a single 3rd century source, and then in the 390s. It's not medical discoveries or scriptural texts that prompted people to believe in ideas like hymens, and no religious or intellectual tradition single-handedly invented and catalyzed such beliefs. They all played a part. Why did this cross-cultural turn toward making virginity perceptible happen? I mentioned possible factors without pretending that there's one simple answer. I think studies of specific groups are best, and I propose answers for Christian sources and their hymen-like notions by describing purposes the notions served. The early outliers in Carthage reflect early emergence of formal virginity vows and pressure to ensure that celibate people were staying celibate. The new hymen idea in Roman circles came in handy in Carthage and later in other communities with similar concerns. A claim that Mary's sex organs stayed miraculously closed as she gave birth to Jesus eventually became official church teaching and would have been useful for other theological debates in the 2nd to mid 4th centuries, but that's not where it first appeared. Instead, Mary's closed womb made its debut in a Latin-speaking debate called the Jovinianist controversy in the 390s, and a Greek-speaking debate called the Nestorian controversy in the 420s and 430s. In these debates, Leaders used the image of Mary's closed womb to support arguments that lifelong virginity is better than marriage, or that Christ's divine and human natures are fully united. One of the influential Latin authors came to use enclosed organs as a symbol of consecrated virgins' seclusion and Christians' pure faith, thus creating a new biological basis for older agendas. Leaders who anatomized virginity tried to make blurry boundaries solid. Like Christ becoming incarnate, virginity took flesh, becoming newly visible and tangible. The advantages of anatomized virginity came with costs. Women at all levels of society could face new levels of scrutiny and, in some cases, invasive contact. The shift entrenched older Greek and Roman tendencies to see virginity loss as a violent encounter between active male and passive female partners, now with the disturbing claim that men alter virgins' very anatomy. Mechanistic pictures where virginity resides in an organ and departs at penetration, whether a virgin wills it or not, thwarted the logical coherence and pastoral efforts of leaders like Augustine, who made chastity a matter of the will, but made virginity a combination of chastity and genital intactness. Virginity had already become a way to embody exceptional likeness to God or intimacy with God, a spiritual state women were told to make evident in their whole way of appearing and behaving. Thinkers who also made it anatomical made it more fragile than ever. These ways of perceiving women's bodies and defining virginity were not inevitable. The sheer variety of the pictures makes that clear. Ideas have a history. They arise at particular times and places for particular purposes. Examining a problematic idea's history makes it easier to question it, to transform it, to help others loosen their grip on it. Medical debates over whether to interpret part of the genital landscape as a hymen recurred in every period after late antiquity, as did deliberation on whether virginity can be lost against one's will and whether lost virginity can ever be restored. Virginity's history is uneven, nonlinear, with changing meanings for terms along the way. Such histories let us look at current preconceptions and issues in a new light. What will our frameworks be for conceptualizing, naming, and caring for human bodies today? I'll turn it over now to moderator Shola and our guest speakers.
Wow, 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 wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for that thought-provoking summary. Can't believe that was just 15 minutes. Whew. Yeah, we see the hand claps in the chat already. Let's take a moment. If people have questions, let's just take a few seconds. You can type those questions in the Q&A button. Thank you so much for that. Just I appreciate just the complexity you name about the topic of virginity. What exactly makes a person a virgin? How is it tested? How is it constructed? Very fascinating. You can also, folks, the book is out there. You can read more. I'm going to invite up our next panelist, Dr. Maia Kotrosits. Let me say that again. Dr. Maia Kotrosits, who is, first of all, a Union alum. And she is currently at the University of Waterloo's Institute for Hellenistic Studies. She has done a lot of work on material culture, the real, and experience in early Christian history. Welcome, Dr. Kotrosits. Over to you.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to say yes, probably.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So I'm really honored to be part of this. I really admire Dr. Lillis's book and the vast kind of archives it organizes and just the program of the book. So thank you for that. I want to begin by noting that quite apart from what European modernist paradigms for doing history have told us, we need to think of the work of history as a spiritual enterprise. To do history is slow work, it's deliberate work, but I think it is spiritual work. It's about reckoning with forces beyond ourselves. It's about understanding relations between the living and the dead, understanding our relationships to those who precede us. It is about honoring those relationships as ones that have carved out the shape of the present. So this is not terribly revolutionary to say. In fact, it seems that almost everyone but the European modernist tradition seems to have figured this out. But that is also to say that, frankly, spirituality without history cannot do all the work it wants and needs to do. That the work of justice demands a reckoning with pasts, both recent and distant, in order to be thick, lasting, and real. And this is why I do the work of history, why I feel that work to be important. So with that ethos in mind, I'd like to say just what a remarkable resource and thought project Virgin Territory is. The book arrives on the scene in a moment in which the micromanagement of bodies marked as female has increasingly high, even dire, stakes attached to it. In a moment in which the state seeks increasing management of the body's gendered signs and significations. It arrives in a moment of anti-choice legislation and suspicion of birth control, the tracking of athletes' periods, genital inspections of athletes who are suspected of being trans, the criminalization of drag and care for trans kids, and more. While Dr. Lillis does not lay out these particular connections, she does elaborate through the argument of the book a point that is at the heart of these political exigencies. The body is an extremely various and high voltage site for social and political claims. That is, most of the time, even when we say the body, as Dr. Lillis has just said, we never mean or imagine the same thing. The body is, among other things, an imagined landscape. Dr. Lillis's history is a history of anatomization of an abstract and gendered concept. Or rather, I should say a history of attempts to anatomize an abstract and gendered concept. Attempts that demonstrate just how slippery it is to do so and how ultimately frustrating the task is. What I'd like to offer by way of response is Dr. Lillis's history's futures. That is to say, I'd like to offer a picture of these same struggles and frustrations with the body in the key of colonial modernity, but also the future possibilities of scholarship on antiquity, Christianity, and the body. So indeed, drawing specifically from the title of the book, I'd like to play up the territory and her concomitant metaphor of mapping used throughout the book to ask how sexuality, physiology, and specifically interiors marked as female are colonial projects, and what that might yield for expanding Dr. Lillis's work. So Dr. Lillis herself invites this connection in describing her choice of these metaphors of territory and mapping. She writes, "The phrase virgin territory has a politically fraught history. Europeans colonizing the Americas compared them to a virginal woman and circulated the idea that the land was uncultivated and ripe for the taking. Native American claims could be dismissed if their land was conceptualized as virgin territory waiting to be possessed through European colonial expansion. My observation that early Christian writers treat virginity as territory draws attention to the complex interests at stake," end quote. And in the contemporary examples I gave of the regulation of particular gendered bodies, we should notice that these are state regulations within a regime of nationalism and statecraft, one that is also connected very much to national border violence, the sterilization of indigenous women or migrant women on the border, for example, and a desire for a racially pure interior of the nation. In this way, Dr. Lillis's metaphor is strikingly literal and material. And it is that, in fact, this interior that I'd like to take up. In the ancient world, long before late antiquity, there was a lot of imaginative energy around bodies marked as female, especially the interior. In a certain way, interiority was synonymous with women's bodies, what marked them as such. In the Greek writer Hesiod's story of the creation of the first woman, Pandora, she's linked conceptually with an internal space, the jar, which gets translated with the equally euphemistic box. The womb was understood as a container, and its perceived openness was problematic. So while heeding Dr. Lillis's caution that virginity was never, and still is never, conceptually reducible to physiology, and the physiology of virginity itself signified in a wide variety of ways, I do want to notice the spatial dynamics of some of these notions of virginity, which relied on untouched space. I want especially to notice this because in modernity, as I've hinted just a minute ago, women's sexuality, interiority, and colonized territory and race were not just entangled, but they were actually constituted together. So let me give a couple of more distinct specific examples, which precede this contemporary history of gendered and racial boundary formation. So I'll call this the dark continent. In fact, the dark continent was how Freud, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, described women's sexuality. It was how he registered his frustrations with what he perceived as the obscurities of women's sexuality. Freud's work was, if nothing else, a kind of mapping of the interior, in his case, the interior of the psyche. But what's more, Freud understood his work as a kind of archaeology, this excavation of the layers of history internal to the human mind. But the metaphor of the dark continent is quite interestingly borrowed. And Freud borrows it from a Welsh adventurer named Henry Morton Stanley. And his expeditions to Africa aided and abetted the 19th century mapping and colonization of Central Africa. Ranjana Khanna has written a book that includes a lengthy discussion of the resonances between Freud and Stanley. It's called Dark Continents. It's wonderful. Particularly noticing that Stanley's travel tales are beset with these deep anxieties about women, and that likewise Freud imagined women's sexuality as containing traces of an undeveloped primordial phase, one preceding civilization. So the idea is that whilst Freud speaks more distinctly of gender and sexuality, and Stanley speaks more distinctly of racialized territory, in both cases, the metaphor conjures eroticized, racialized space. And Stanley and Freud they don't only understand their work as forms of adventure and expedition, but they also find their thinking shaped by archaeology. Both of them do. So they were both sort of preoccupied with depth, the spatialization of obscurity. Geography personalized, the interior which cannot be seen, but apparently invites some kind of insinuation. And I have a quote from Stanley, which I'll just give you a little taste of it. He says, "I then became possessed of over 130 books upon Africa, which I studied with the zeal of one who had living interest in the subject. I knew what had been accomplished by African explorers, and I knew how much of the dark interior was still unknown to the world." So the interior of sexualized, racialized space was literal in the work of Stanley's contemporary, and that is James Marion Sims. And this is another father figure, right? So Dr. Lillis has her fathers. We're dealing with some other fathers here too. So this time is the father of modern gynecology in North America. Sims experimented on the bodies of enslaved women in order to develop one of his signature gynecological procedures, for which he became very famous. Gynecology in general in this era was, to quote Deirdre Cooper Owens, being formalized and legitimated on the reproductive organs and bodies of Black women. Owens's book entitled Medical Bondage, she shows how gynecology was in part founded in this period in order to increase the capacities of enslaved women by quote unquote fixing the injuries incurred to their bodies from rape and forced reproduction. Race and colonization was not just the pretext of these gynecologists' medical knowledge. It was actually the beating heart of their medical ruminations. 19th century race science was diagnosing, and that is to say, manufacturing features as physiologically racial. Pelvimetry measures the size of a woman's pelvis and assesses her ability to give birth. And this was a kind of racialized meta-language, Cooper Owens writes, and it's built on the house of cards of racial presumption. but it was then trotted out to prove racial difference. The thing is, the inside of the body ended up being tricky. Gynecological medicine was, quoting Cooper Owens again, one of the first and foremost fields in which the failures of race science were revealed. Because once doctors examined, excised, and sometimes preserved Black women's sexual organs in jars, they could not accurately detect whether a burst ovary or a small cervix belonged to a Black woman or a white woman. So in other words, the ambiguities of social life were worked out here through anatomical description, and it falls apart. This modern history might draw us back to the ancient world, in fact, to see the way that gender itself was already a key player in the making of racialized populations in the Greek classical period. So the Greek writer Hippocrates, which is famous for the Hippocratic Oath, of course, his text Airs, Waters, Places, which is 5th century BCE, quite a bit before late antiquity, of course. One of the very earliest known texts of the Greek medical tradition, we find a notion of the body as a natural phenomenon, its features and its symptoms. In other words, it's bound up in landscapes and the climate and weather and geography. And the symptoms of the body are seen to be, in balance or out of balance with those elements. The older idea was that the body was just at the mercy of the gods, right? So we find other things in this text, though, and that includes the naturalization of conventional understandings of gender, which at that time were less about organs and more about hot and cold and theories of bodily substance. But we also find in this text bodies imagined in ethnic or racializing terms. That is, we see how medical literature's normative judgments on bodies, its pathologies, are conditioned by not just gendered hierarchies, but cultural and ethnic hierarchies as well. Understanding the elemental environmental forces that shaped and imbued the composition and disposition of bodies meant not just the manufacturing of medical knowledge then, but knowledge of foreign peoples, that is, racialized others. So that's ethnographic knowledge. There's a quote from Ayres Waters Places on Northern peoples called Scythians, to give an example. Most Scythians, Hippocrates writes, become impotent and do women's work, live like women, talk in the same way. So there's longer there, but I'll just cut that because it's redundant. Scythians, it turns out, in ancient literature were synonymous with a kind of gender queerness, an inversion of gender roles, or at least improper masculinity and femininity. But ancient authors couldn't agree on the ways in which Scythians were queer. But that's because it was not a description of their behaviors. It was rather a mode of racializing them as a people. And even the term Scythians, in fact, is not a self-designation. Rather, Scythians is an outsider term which collects a wide range of northern people in kind of the Black Sea area. And it turns out that so many Scythians were enslaved that Scythian sometimes just simply was shorthand for meaning enslaved person. So in other words, this medical and ethnographic literature was full of ideological implications even before they offered any descriptions at all. So we can clearly see how gender, sexuality, disease, and ethnicity or racialization are all at play. Indeed, the fact that historical contemporaneity, Indeed, the fact of historical contemporaneity between Ayres Waters Places and Herodotus's histories, which is the earliest surviving model of ethnography, the fact that these happen at the same time suggests that in Greek cultural history, the medical body and the ethnographic body are products of the very same imagination. That is, the medicalized body and the racialized body in the Greek tradition were composed together. We further see this overlap of pathologizing, racializing gestures in physiognomy, the ancient practice of scrutinizing the body's visual signs to reveal the truth of more abstract realities. In Greek and Roman cultural history, physiognomy was part art and part science, and it was about the deduction of character traits. Character traits, however, were often overtly ethnically or racially inflected and produced a diagnosis through this kind of graphic scrutiny of the body. So all this might seem a bit far afield from the early Christian literature, which Dr. Lillis and I study. But the ancient context is more than simply the background or future into which Christianity unfolds. These Greek and Roman notions of the body, of peoplehood, of gender, and disease are the cultural language that Christianity uses to speak itself into being. And Christianity is clearly not incidental to these modern European colonial futures either. And here is exactly where I'd like to return to the mapping and territory of virginity. This is all to say that what Dr. Lillis makes available for us in her painstaking and ultimately deconstructive work is the recognition of the imaginative force of virginity as a grid on which bodies and sexualities and their boundaries are produced. What she makes available, therefore, is a connection to this extensive history of pathologization of boundary and population production, a history in which a certain demand is placed on the body to reproduce abstract and elusive concepts, ones that undergird the social order. What do these connections between virginity, colonial territorialization, ethnography, racialization, and its associated pathologies mean for the history of ancient Christianity? Only time will tell. In the meantime, we can thank Dr. Lillis for the work that will contribute to this, and wholeheartedly affirm with Dr. Lillis that while the body's materiality is frequently appealed to for its facticity, its unequivocal presence, it makes for shaky, contested, and even vexing political ground indeed. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's take a moment. I thought that was spoken like a true expert in material culture. Just all the connections to land and bodies and race and objects like jars and medical procedures. That was wonderful. Yes, I see all the affirmations in the chat. Thank you, everyone. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type those out. And in case you missed it, there is the link to buy the book in the chat, and there is a code you can use to save 30% at checkout. We will still share that information throughout this talk, so please keep an eye on that on the chat. Thank you again, Dr. Maia Kotrosits. I will be calling up our next panelist, who is Dr. Saadia Yacoob. She is at Williams College. Her research includes Islamic legal history, Muslim feminist studies, history of sexuality, and slavery studies. Over to you, Dr. Saadia Yacoob.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Kelto Lillis for inviting me to speak on her book today. She and I are grad school buddies. I still remember the first day of orientation at Duke when I met her, and it was so exciting to have a colleague who was thinking about very similar issues as I was, but from a different religious tradition. And that has continued to be such a powerful connection for us over the years as we've kind of moved from grad school into working on dissertation and then book and so on and so forth. I wanted to sort of offer today a kind of reading of virginity and Islamic law that for me was inspired by reading Professor Kelto Lillis's book. So her book on virginity addresses not only the constructions of gender and sexuality, but also historicizes the body, raising critical questions about our reliance on the body as a universal and static given. The discussion on virginity and its conceptualization in early Christian texts made me reflect on discussions on virginity in Islamic law. Now, I study gender and gender in Islamic law. I'm looking particularly, so I do early Islamic law, which for the Islamic tradition, early means basically 8th to 12th century. And I focus particularly on ideas of legal personhood in relation to gender and sexuality, enslavement and childhood. So I'm really interested in the intersection of these different identities between gender, enslavement, childhood. How do all of those identities intersect in creating legal personhood of individuals within the legal text? So of course, the texts that I look at address the issue of virginity, but it's not something that I've really focused on. So reading Dr. Kelto Lillis's book really got me reflecting on some of these things that I've been reading along the way as I've been researching other things, and urged me to sort of think about my own assumptions. So when I read a lot of those discussions on virginity, I just kind of assumed that it meant very similar things to how it is that we might understand virginity in a kind of modern period. But reading Dr. Kelto Lillis's book really got me sort of going back to that material and rethinking, what precisely is being discussed in these texts with regards to virginity. So I wanted to give a bit of an overview for those who are unfamiliar with Islamic law as to how and when virginity even comes up as a conversation. So really, virginity becomes important for these jurists who are writing these legal texts because it determines certain aspects of the legal status of women in relation to marriage. And an important thing to kind of distinguish here, because we're talking about the pre-modern world, that ideas of freedom and enslavement are always at play in thinking about the legal rights of individuals. And so for these jurists, really the virginity becomes an important matter really in relation to free women, because whether or not they're able to contract their own marriages depends on a kind of virgin status. Whereas for enslaved women, because they did not have the right to make decisions regarding their own marriage, therefore virginity really, does not become a concern with regards to them. So in relation to free women, her legal status in contracting her marriage is impacted by whether or not she's a virgin. So legal schools differed on this. There's in Islamic law, there's a number of different legal schools, and they all have different methodologies that they're coming from, and so they arrive at different conclusions. So they're different on this, but generally, being of virgin status meant that there were greater constraints on the ability of a free woman to contract her own marriage. So majority of the legal schools did not allow her to contract her own marriage. Her consent was necessary, but her marriage was contracted by male kin, usually the father or the paternal grandfather. And the one legal school that does give her the ability to contract her own marriage still allows the male kin to challenge her marriage because she is of virgin status. Now, a non-virgin, and there are terms that are used. So the other sort of complication thinking about this is the issue of translation. So the word in Arabic for what translates most closely as virgin in English is bikr, and then the word for a woman who's not a virgin is thayyib. So there's also, I think, for me now, questions that are being raised of, well, why have we sort of translated this as virgin and non-virgin? But I'll sort of suspend that question for now and just work with those translations. So the non-virgin woman, a free woman, could contract her own marriage and her decisions could not be challenged. So that's kind of why virginity becomes important for the legal status and the legal rights of an individual. So what constitutes somebody as a virgin? That becomes sort of the next question, right, for jurists, is that, well, if you're going to create such a critical distinction in terms of whether a free woman can contract her own marriage, whether that marriage can be challenged, then, well, what constitutes, right, what defines virginity? Here again, we have differing ideas based on different legal schools. Some of it, seems to very much concur with Dr. Kelto Lillis's research about the sort of late ancient shift in the idea of virginity being something that is observable. So in an 11th century legal text, for example, we see a jurist discuss a situation where a virgin woman is married, but then does not display signs of virginity, right, at the point of consummation. And the answer that he gives is that this does not challenge the virgin status of the woman, because it could be that she had a very hard fall, and this could have made her lose her virginity. So the interesting thing there is, that there's something assumed to be observable in virginity in a woman's body. But what exactly that is, how does it get lost or dislodged because of a hard fall, is something that he doesn't really get into. So there's no precise kind of discussion on what this physical sign of virginity is or how it would be lost. There does seem to be the assumption that there is something physical about virginity, and that it's also observable, that there's something that happened at consummation that raised questions about the woman's virginity. So there's something observable about it. And I really find helpful here Dr. Kelto Lillis's distinction between physiology and anatomy, and in thinking about whether it's about certain things that the body does, right, at the at the point of consummation, versus it being something physiological, right, that is being lost or something of that nature. But interestingly, virginity was not primarily about a physical marker, but instead was tied to marriage. So the jurists assumed that if a free woman was never married, then she was a virgin. And if she was known to be married, then she was a non-virgin. So in a way, what I'm thinking is that virginity is essentially a kind of legal fiction. So the jurists say, for example, that a woman who was a virgin, who's been raped, or she commits illicit sexual intercourse, would legally still be treated as a virgin in her legal status with regards to marriage, because she was never married. And their concern here is essentially that if they gave her the legal status of a non-virgin, that would open her up to social scrutiny about her chastity. And this would be harmful to her as an individual. And so in order to kind of protect her, there is, virginity gets tied to whether or not she is known to have been previously married. So virginity then becomes a kind of a legal fiction, right, at the same time. And there's I should mention also that raising questions about a woman's virginity is a very grave matter in Islamic law. So if somebody wants to raise a question, whether it's the husband or the husband's family members, they want to raise a question about a woman's virginity, that is something that, if they don't have proof for it, that she has committed illicit sexual intercourse, then they would be punished for slander, essentially. And of course, there are similar things to what Dr. Kelto Lillis describes of oaths that a woman takes. So rather than somehow subjecting her to a physical examination, there is the idea of an oath that a woman takes in order to give testimony to her own chastity. So why was virginity tied to legal status for free women? So jurists talk about how virginity is tied to life experience and wisdom. So women who are not virgins have greater knowledge of the world, particularly of men, and this experience is necessary for them to make sound decisions regarding them. Whereas virgins would not have had access to such experiences, so they can't be relied upon to make sound decisions regarding their own marriage, which is both about them as an individual, but also obviously about the larger, broader family, because there are kinship connections that are formed through marriage. So we see this assumption most clearly in juristic discussions on whether a woman who's never been married but is now older, would she take on the legal status of a virgin or a non-virgin? And they disagree. Some schools say that she still remains a non-virgin. Others say, well, no, now she's gotten the experience of, that is what is assumed with loss of virginity, and therefore she takes on the status of a non-virgin woman. So you can see also here that virginity is tied to a kind of it's not important in and of itself, but for what it marks of a free woman's life experiences, her stage in the life cycle, and what that then means for the expansion of her legal rights as an individual in society. So while jurists seem to have some conception of virginity being either physiological or even anatomical, they did not subject women to physical exams, because to do so would question her chastity, which is sinful, right, and carried legal ramifications. So virginity is a legal marker that is tied to legal status rather than something that's physical, and is largely relevant for issues pertaining to marriage rather than other aspects of a free woman's rights as a legal subject. So in commercial aspects of the law, for example, because a free woman would have the right to property ownership, whether she is a virgin or not a virgin is not something that is taken into consideration in what she, the use that she makes of her wealth. It is also, and then as I mentioned earlier, even though enslaved women and free women would be seen as having the same kind of anatomy in the ways that jurists would see them as both having female bodies, virginity does not become important for the enslaved woman because they don't have control over their sexuality. And so therefore, these kinds of decisions about marriage and whether they can enter into marriage of their own accord or not doesn't become important. And one of the critical rights that an enslaved woman would gain over herself upon emancipation becomes this control over sexuality. So this is just to kind of give a brief sort of idea of what it is that I'm thinking about, having read Dr. Kelto Lillis's book and going back into some of the research that I've done and really critically thinking about assumptions that I had made. So I just wanted to offer how it is that Dr. Kelto Lillis's book inspired me to think about some of the work that I'm doing in my field, because these questions about historicizing our own assumptions about gender, sexuality, the body are so very critical and are helpful as provocations in many different fields. And I think this is what I find so powerful about historical study, is its ability to denaturalize for us things that we see as universal. So even if the historical conception of gender and sexuality is not one that we want to uphold, right? So we go back to these texts and ideas that they have, and there are not things that we want to uphold. I think just showing that our ideas are not universal by holding it up against these kinds of historical conceptions of the body, of gender and sexuality, is very powerful in undoing the authoritative hold that these ideas have on us. And given the current moment that we're in, where we're really trying to push against the gender binary and sexual binary, and really trying to affirm the diversity of human gender and sexual experiences, I think this kind of historical study that Dr. Kelto Lillis is offering us is a very powerful way of moving forward in that discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Saadia Yacoob, for that insightful, fascinating edition, especially from the Islamic perspective. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's take a moment. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button to send those. That was amazing. Thank you. I'm going to call up next Dr. Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones. She's at Boston College. She has done a lot of work in Mariology in Black feminist and womanist thought. And she is working on material that centers the icon of are you ready? The Black Madonna. Welcome, Dr. Adkins-Jones.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I tried to be cute and supportive, but my hair is blocking the image of this incredible exquisite book behind me. It is so exciting and an honor and a pleasure to join the conversation this morning and this celebration. Dr. Lillis, Julie, we're just so excited for you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for writing this book. It is wonderful, and I will say that we only realized this. I too was a graduate school sojourner with Julie, and it was 10 years later that we realized that both of our dissertations, we had both written dissertations titled Virgin Territory with different, very different sort of senses of engagement. But I think that it speaks to not only our creative and intellectual kinship, but I think it also speaks to the fact that this topic, this question of virginity and multiple virginities and multiplicities of meaning, carries so much weight and so much impact. Saadia Hartman talks in terms of Black studies and the histories of enslavement and colonialism, of the afterlives of slavery, right? The past that is never the past. And that is not different from the sentiment and the sensibilities around sex and gender and bodies and policing and hymenal integrity and the questions that you're raising and helping us to think through and really a powerful way, particularly the way that so many early, so many of our early church fathers, so many of our patristic resources are conflated and made monoliths on this topic. So I'm excited. And in reading this book and thinking about how to respond today, which was no easy feat because you have left us with a proverbial mic drop of nuance and consideration that feels increasingly rare in this world, and especially what we would imagine to be something of the popular American Christian imagination, and all of the sort of contemporary questions and emphases that your introduction so helpfully just brings to the forefront of our mind, even as we go back to some of these early texts. I actually thought of two very disparate, yet I think important moments of more recent tenure in my mind that I hope do not seem completely out of the blue, but I hope can center the ways that perhaps we see these kinds of questions as they have toggled through the church and have been ensconced, made reified in these various kinds of ways. Like we want to make virginity solid, right? Like this had to happen. The ways that some of the ideas of more recent in my life, the ways that these sort of popped into my mind. And so the first is Hocus Pocus, the movie. I have several children, 4 in fact, and thanks to the wonders of TikTok time travel, I've rejoiced that they are suddenly interested in music that they deem vintage, which is simply music from the 90s, and the same sort of fashion trends and varying themes and nostalgia from my youth. And it was Halloween last year, and they wanted to watch Hocus Pocus, this resurgence of Hocus Pocus 2, and the tale of the famed Sanderson sisters, because, well, who doesn't love Bette Midler? And we thought it would be a cute time. And lo and behold, I had completely misremembered Hocus Pocus as a movie. And my lack of memory meant that I was wholly unprepared for a narrative so deeply entrenched in literally the magic of virginity. And the plot of the entire movie, it's a terrible movie. It's just a cult classic, like most cult classics are. If you haven't seen it though, the plot of the entire movie sort of hinges on, I think, what would be a fairly normative experience, if not highly ubiquitous characteristic of young adulthood. And that's that this young man is a 15-year-old-ish virgin. And the theme and recurring incitement of the resurrection of these three sisters who are witches is tied to the unveiling. And I do mean unveiling in that Greek sense of apocalypse, right? The world is about to be undone. This tied to this unveiling that, quote, a virgin lit the candle. And that quote actually comes from this young man's 8-year-old sister, nonetheless. And the constant refrain of this movie, mind you, I'm watching this with my kids and being like, I didn't remember any of this. But the constant refrain of this movie is this notion of this young man's virginity as being a refrain of ridicule and shame. The young woman in the movie, you know, she can't light the candle. So it's always like, it's already like, what's happening here? And this candle, which is perhaps, you know, phallic and magical and has its own ritual lighting, confirms the anatomized integrity of this boy's body at the risk of global implosion and wickedness, to include a slaughter of the innocents. They're about to, you know, take the life force of all of these children in this town, in Salem, Massachusetts, to include a slaughter of the innocents as a source of life. I will spare more details than this, and if you can't follow, you don't have to watch the movie to get this. But I accept to say that, one, this was not the movie I remembered, and I was wondering where my parents were when I was watching this movie in 1993. But also that I was completely shocked by how casually the notions of virginity and the meanings of shame and the meanings of rites of passage, right? Like this idea that this person should not be a virgin, are so deeply embedded and so casually embedded, and the assumptions of our social context and moments. The second thought that came to my mind in reading this text, well, the second of like 3,000, to be honest, but the second thought is also a bit shorter to narrate. And that is simply one of my continued frustrations around school curriculums and censorship, councils like the College Board, decisions like that of African American Studies AP curriculum, or terrible and flat out ignorant, divisive, or not ignorant, but intentional, systemic, and arguably, perhaps theologically evil elisions and erasures of history under some false guise of being woke or a misrepresentation of critical race theory, as it were. By which I mean to say that of the many detailed nuances that I loved reviewing here in your text, Dr. Lillis, particularly as someone who thinks a lot about theology and the utility of Mary. I'm also a Black Studies scholar, and particularly thinking about Mary with regard to race and gender and sexuality and class, and many of the topics that Maya has so helpfully mentioned in our conversation. There is so clearly to me a deeply problematic, sometimes twisted, very presumptive and monolithic set of ideas still circulating around virginity and its value that continue to persist in the world, but that continue to persist in popular culture, particularly in her most spirited and perhaps her most spiritual, but maybe not religious forms, that goes too easily uninterrogated for the ways it forms our moral and ethical sense of self and action. And so I am haunted by this question, and I wish more people were. What do we know about virginity? Because it is certainly not as much as we assume and not as much as we assert. And the other point that I'm just trying to make is that history really matters, not only for its power to tell the truth, but for its power to dispel the untruths, the half-truths, the not-truths, and even the lies that we cling to, particularly in relationship to questions of virtue, purity, righteousness, holiness, and of course, moral superiority, without interrogating the nuance, multiplicity, creativity of issues, topics, ideas, and meanings without interrogating power or patriarchy or whiteness or surveillance or violence as well. And so if we read carefully this work, if we take you seriously, and I completely do, you're unmooring, Dr. Lillis, of virginity from some sense of God-given fact. And as many would tell it, some spare, self-retained notion of virginity as a kind of sacramental element of the body. The notion or theological imaginary around virginity as a kind of holy grace that preserves and should be preserved. And that preserves at the site of the vagina, at the site of this female hymen, some semblance or connection to God, some spiritual significance, some connection some mysterious connection to Eden, even. That this should be the subject of several contemporary church councils, because virginity is indeed a social construct, and one that continues to retain the capacity for gross violence as much as it does some idea of female or women's empowerment. And I too am using, in the ways that Dr. Lillis so helpfully lays out, the ways that we still are pushed and have to rely on the sexed limitations and binary notions of gender here, because of the ways that virginity has been so deeply historically and entrenched and aligned as such, and because of the ways that notions of virginity, who should have it, who shouldn't, a la hocus pocus as one of many examples, of course, continues to circulate, particularly among heterosexist and or homophobic formulations of partnership, of value, of worth, and of course, marriage. We have in this text and with you, we have been asked not only to theorize closed wombs, but also clearly closed ears. And this is, and I loved this as a theological point, what Dr. Lillis describes as a kind of incarnation of virginity, which I would argue requires us to take up the incantations of virginity as well. So when I'm not here on Saturday morning, my work thinks about the fungibility of the notion of purity, particularly sexual purity, as it shifts and maintains impact upon colonial encounters. And again, I do this from a theological grounding, as well as a grounding in African and African diaspora studies. And I think about the assumptions of vaginas and penises and intercourse as they relate to rape and reproduction, particularly when met with questions of race. So Black and brown bodies, as they exist in a broader imagination, not only of European Christian colonial enterprise, but how those bodies and what those bodies do, what can be done with those bodies, are intersected through notions of God's order of creation, domination, place, reproduction, lineage, and how notions of purity can and do inform the notions of consumption. So who is available and who is not. In other words, how hymen-like imaginaries can be a metaphor for the ways that sex, sexuality, access, and notions of purity open and foreclose other kinds of possibilities in life as well. And so I am impressed by so much of the analysis of this book. Not only you're taking up of so many of our theological reflections, our theological expositors that get taken for granted, especially your work on Augustine, which is, and also these notions of the closed wound and when that's happening, and the Jovinius and Nestorian controversies. But also the way that I love the way that you clarify Origen and Tertullian. And you say this on page 72 in your book, in the context of what Tertullian is doing. You say that, quote, giving birth makes Mary a woman instead of a virgin. And this is, if you haven't read the text yet, Dr. Lillis has just so finely separated out these threads of what exactly is happening with these uses of virgin and what we're meaning and what we're not, even if these different figures are referencing the same scriptures and same patterns in the text. And so at this point, this quote just struck me: giving birth makes Mary a woman instead of a virgin. And it just made me wonder again if Simone de Beauvoir has continually had her point proven that a woman is not born, she is made. And I would extend from my own interest, but also with the resources of this text, the same formulation that a virgin is not born, she is made. And these historical questions are necessary for us to think carefully around bodies, place, possibility, and justice. And it has been incredible. And so since I'm going last, I'd like to look or point us to some of the ripple effects of your analysis, if you will. I feel like you have thrown a stone into the pond of virginity, and we can just see this expand and grow, in the ponds and with the tides, if you will. In part because my work theologically, I'm interested in how boundaries shift, and the invocation of the map, the territory metaphors that you use, and the ways that maps change over time, so to speak. So I have a few questions that you are welcome to reflect on. I know we have limited time, as you wish, but hopefully to also maybe point out some of the directions that the many creative interventions and directions that your work is pointing to and asking of all of your readers, but that I feel are being asked of me as well. And so the first is, in kind of a broader sense, while you work in early Christianity, I wonder if you thought about or how you track the relationship of these shifting vicissitudes of virginity. You quote Traub's cycles of salience, as you say, or even just the territory of virginity as it widens, and expands, as borders are names and walls built around the other Marian dogmas. So the Marian dogmas in the Roman Catholic Church we're thinking about perpetual virginity, which actually comes later than we might expect. But we also have divine motherhood, we have the Marian Assumption, and we have, this is what I'm interested in, the Immaculate Conception. And so I'm interested on the reliance on the notion of the closed womb, the closed door, the closed gate as scriptural basis for understanding the function of Mary's body as a potential virgin and as a mother. And the ways, as you think about Origen and Tertullian, how they're using different expressions of meaning and the need to not only close Mary's womb through this trinity of, as you quote on, or as you say on page 93, reproductive exceptionalism, sexual inexperience, and anatomical intactness all at once. So that emerged, what you describe as a new orthodoxy that emerged with regard to Mary's virginity after childbirth, and the kind of womb analysis that comes from that. Next, do I have to cut off? Are you cutting me off?
Please.
Oh, okay, can I ask my last question?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. Okay, I want to know, let's say virgin territory becomes required reading. What, after you have, birthed this book, I would also like to know, there's a lot of historical questions I'm missing. Oh, shoot. Well, where do we go from here? What would you love to see? And given that we can, in your work, trace the incarnation of virginity in early Christian thought, do you think virginity is a helpful category or construct for Christian thought today? I'm sorry to have run over. I planned this in the time, but thank you so much for your book, for this invitation, and for your time. I'm truly so grateful.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Whew. Okay, so right now we're going to take just like a 1 minute breather just from all of this, a screen break, a stretch break. And once we come back from that 1 minute break, we would have, we would attend to the Q&A. Thank you all so much for turning in your questions. Let's have a 1 minute break. Also on the screen, you would see Also in the chat, we will put out a link for the book and the promo code. All right. I know that was a quick break, but we would love to take as many questions as much as possible as well. Thank you again all so much. I'm going to call up Dr. Julie Kelto Lillis to respond to the panelists in general.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, everybody. I learn so much from your work every time, and the ways that we've been able to compare some of our materials. It's just stunning to see even more of the overlaps and then the really important differences. I was going to start noticing some of the themes that are coming up in the chat comments and the Q&A and in questions that some of you posed or present day issues some of you raised. Maybe I could say a few quick things about the takeaways today, or, where could we take this knowledge, to something new. So picking up on that last question from Amy about the whether virginity is useful now, or is it a worthy, concept to still be having? I think it depends. I think it can be. There's a lot of people who say this is a problem, a problem concept with tons of baggage. We should just get rid of it. And this sort of historicizing, destabilizing project definitely can help with making that case. The other thing it can help with, though, another strategy that sociologists have often noted is that groups who don't see themselves reflected in the conventional sort of heteronormative patterns and the gender patterns of how traditional virginity and virginity loss concepts have developed, a lot of times people take the concepts and instead of getting rid of them, they redefine them or they queer them. They do something that's more expansive. They think more flexibly and go in a new creative direction. And some of the really profound theological moments in the early Christian literature where virginity becomes incredible likeness to God, participation in divine tranquility or immortality, or intimacy with God of an incredible kind, where humans take part in God's creative, ever-generating power without necessarily having to go along with what society expects from them for reproduction, right? There's all of these really profound directions Christian thinkers move in, and they can sort of play with these available various definitions to do that. So anybody today who wants to keep virginity and virginity loss with whatever good, bad, neutral kind of valence it might have, they're in good company if they want to play around with it and redefine it. That's what tons of intellectual or spiritual ancestors have done. So that's one thought that I was thinking. There are so many issues now that feel related to this. Some of you mentioned reproductive regulation, gender identity, questions and tensions today. And I was thinking especially of just the importance of being able to destabilize appeals to biology, at least in the overly simplistic way that they tend to be used politically right now. If we were going to go to biology of gender by some of the feminist people working on that, they could point out that if we're thinking about anatomy and physiology, you can have like 5 or 6 different levels or forms or measures for even biological sex of the body. And they don't always all line up in an individual person. So thinking about that kind of work and thinking about the ways that cultures have to teach us how to experience and interpret and conceptualize our bodies, that we never just sort of look around and, you know, tell it like it is. We've always learned like how to experience it, how to see what we see. Noting all of that, thinking about the variety of our bodies, the complexity of our ideas about them, I think that gives us a way to resist those really simplistic political arguments in favor of binary gender, to have more permission for those who need more permission, perhaps, to think more imaginatively and more compassionately about things like gender. So as far as other ways that I'd like to see people take the knowledge, you know, beyond what we think about ourselves, what we think about some of these regulatory issues, one last sort of present day takeaway that I might mention or point people toward in the book and in some other literature is virginity testing and some of the ways that can be a microcosm for the complexity of human rights work. If anybody wants to see some of the things that get criticized as very problematic or traumatic and unjust about some of the purposes that virginity testing happened for, the World Health Organization has a summation of a lot of that in a 2018 recommendation to ban virginity testing. There are also, you know, well-intentioned ways people have tried to use virginity testing, like forensically, because of abuse or violence, that still are very problematic. But on the other hand, some of the uses of testing have a lot to do with protecting Indigenous and minority values, worldviews, cultures. And doing this project taught me in a whole new way, helped me understand much more deeply the, you know, amazing number of problems that, as post-colonial and decolonial work has taught us, that also arise if folks try to kind of swoop out from the outside and like rescue women in a distant culture, right? And especially that for those of us thinking about theological and religious worldviews, there are real differences between different groups around the world that a sort of Western discourse of individual human rights sometimes simply does not leave room for, or does not like take into account for thinking about how to leverage legislation and other kinds of tools to make a more just world. So on that note of, you know, even more complexity, I think I'll pause and see if we have time for a couple more questions. I had my eye on one or two, but I want to also defer to you, Shola.
Yeah, there are a group of questions. I apologize. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. I will say that for some of you who have asked questions directly to panelists, for example, there are questions on the Islamic side of things. I encourage you to please feel free to reach out to Dr. Saadia Yacoob. I'm sure if you Googled the name, you would find a link to somewhere with her professional email that you can ask those specific questions. Sorry, but thank you as well. There are a group of questions around men, actually, and whether there are parallels in ancient material about virginity concerns with men, whether there is today as well, how men potentially could be allies since they seem not to be as much under scrutiny as female bodies are. And maybe in addition to that, we will put the LGBTQ plus folks who the whole gender binary doesn't even work to begin with. And so just like thinking about how they potentially function in these territories of virginity mapping.
Yeah, these are such great questions. Speaking to that question that I get a lot, and I think some of my students and my class later today are going to ask this too, that men's virginity, it's not totally non-existent as a concept, and it's not totally invisible in the sources, but it's not as prominent. It's much more rare to see a test for male virginity based in anatomy or physiology, not completely unheard of. And you do get some situations in literature where male virginity is tested by ordeal, where other kinds of measures or proofs are important. It's just not usually biologized in quite the same way. Though there are some examples I'm thinking of more recently in some contexts where sometimes folks who test women's virginity will say, I can also do this for boys. It's just a different measure. So the possibility is there. It could have arisen. It could have caught on as a thing. The fact that it didn't, I suspect, has to do with how much more natural it has felt in a lot of cultures with a pretty hard patriarchal slant. Or in New Testament and early Christian stuff, sometimes we say kyriarchal to think about all the different axes of power that are operating. It seemed probably a lot more natural because of social systems to create this for women's bodies and expect to find asymmetrically proofs in women's bodies and not in men's bodies. Plus, meanwhile, people are saying a lot, in early Christianity at least, about circumcision, about castration. There's a lot else going on about men's organs that's also very graphic and has to do with sort of directing attention to areas that they also say you need to be very modest about, thinking about. But yeah, it seems to not gain traction or arise in quite the same way for men. The question of inclusion across genders today, I would sort of redirect back to what I was thinking with virginity being a thing that people can hang on to as a concept or jettison, something that we have the freedom and power to do new things with, to actually consciously decide to invent, what they're going to be if we want to. A lot of this inventing in history, these forces, that a lot of us were alluding to that shape our thought and systems, most of the inventing and developing happens without realizing that it's a new invention. A lot of times people don't notice how many forces are at work shaping the ways that we come to view and think. But when we do know that, when we do know about it, there are even more possibilities for what we could do and invent instead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will give it back to you, Professor Kelto Lillis, to make any final remarks that you have, and then we close. This has been amazing. I thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the audience for your questions. They're all so thoughtful, and I'm sorry we just didn't have the time to get to them, but thank you. I hope this is more of a starting point in rethinking the category of virginity and to what extent it's going to be useful or not useful for you in your context. So back to you, Professor Lillis. Thank you all again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. There are so many more things we can say. I notice all four of us are thinking about slavery in connection with virginity. All of us are thinking some thoughts about Mary, some other things in our conversations longer term as well. So I won't try to load us with more here, but I want to just sort of also do visual clapping for the guests, and my great gratitude to all of you for celebrating this with me, and to everybody attending for sending us so many comments and questions as food for our thought. We have them, we'll keep them. So thank you for sharing them.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.